Here's one whereby we can identify ourselves as a clear conscience. The Bible speaks quite a bit about the word, about the aspect of the mind, of the conscience. Only in the New Testament, the word is not found in the Old Testament. But when we think about the conscience, just to distinguish kind of what it is, I think about the mind, and the mind is like a garden. And so now, if you have a garden, and you say, I have a garden in the backyard. And so now I would ask you, what is the garden? Is it the soil, or is it this section of land? What is the garden? Is it a piece of land, or is it the soil that is in that piece of land? You would say both. If you just have the soil and you don't have the section of land, you don't have a garden. And if you have a section but you don't have the soil, you don't have a garden. So it's both a section of land and it's the soil that fills that section. That's kind of like the mind. And so I would say, or I would ask you, do you have potatoes in your garden? And you say, yes, I put a bag of potatoes in my garden yesterday. And so, yes, I have potatoes in the garden. I have a bag of potatoes sitting in the garden. And so, okay, you have potatoes in the garden. I say, what do? They do absolutely nothing. They will just kind of rot away. And so in order for them to grow, you have to actually bury them under the soil, and then they will start bearing root, and then they will start growing, they will start producing. And so when we think about our mind is a little bit like that garden. We have, and the conscience is like the soil. And so that's what sin does. Sin can be on our mind, but it can be on our conscience. And so I can talk about stealing, but I don't feel guilty about it because I don't have a guilty conscience. And so I can freely talk about that, and it doesn't produce any fruit because it's not in the soil, it's just in the garden. And so sometimes there's a thought in my mind that's negative, and I can just throw it out. But it's not, I can't just throw it out if it is in my conscience. And so for an example, if I would go and steal something or I would commit a crime, I couldn't just throw that thought out because now I have buried it in my conscience and now it can produce fruit. And that's what sin was rooted in our conscience. Not just in our mind, but in our conscience. And that's what Jesus came, and that's why he says the axe should be laid to the root. He is not just going to deal with the fruit of sin, but the root of sin, and so he's going to clear the conscience. In other words, he's going to go into the garden and he's going to pull up all those roots and chop them off, and then so that you can put new plants in the garden that can produce good. And so he talks about that, especially in the book of Hebrews, because the Hebrews compares the new covenant with the old covenant and just what is better and what is different. And so in chapter number 9 and verse number 9 it says, which was a figure, the old, for the time then present, so that was only for a time, and which were offered both gifts and sacrifices, that should not make him that did the service perfect. Now listen to this. As pertaining to the conscience. So the old covenant could never dig out the roots of sin, could never clear the conscience. And so it was just a pacifier that would pacify for a time, but it would not take out the roots. And that's why Jesus says, I will lay the axe to the root, I will clear your conscience. And in verse 14 it says, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. chapter number 10 and verse number 2, speaking about the blood of bulls and animals. And it says, for then would they not have ceased to be offered, had those bulls been able to take away the sin or clear the conscience of mankind. They would have just continued therein. There would have been no need for something else. Because that they worshipped once, purged, should have had no more conscience of sins. And so he says, well, if that would have worked, then they would have cleared the conscience. Chapter 10, verse 22, it says, let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience, in our bodies washed with pure water. And so the question I have for you is sin in your conscience? Or is your conscience guilty? Can you pillow your head in peace? That your conscience has been wiped clean? And that you no longer have a guilty conscience, because that's why he says the old covenant could not clear the conscience, but Jesus came to clear the conscience, so that the conscience, and I tell you, that is one of the most wonderful things, to have a clean conscience. And that is a sign of being a child of God, that Jesus has dug into the roots, into the conscience, pulled up those roots and made you free from sin. And maybe sometimes you have a bad thought or something, or this thought goes through your mind, but what does your conscience say? Is your conscience clear of the guilt of sin? And that is a sign of salvation, that we are indeed children of God, have a clear conscience. And that's why God's children can be so bold, so courageous in battle, because they're not fighting their own conscience. And so, our conscience is not our guide, but it's supposed to be. Now, our conscience was messed up with sin and everything, but it has to be established, and that it has the right order. But that's exactly what we can do in the Lord, is establish it so that it can be a guide for us, and so that we can actually do something because our conscience doesn't condemn us. Maybe the whole world will condemn us, but if our conscience doesn't condemn us, we can freely go. But that conscience has to be cleared, and then it has to be established in the Lord. But first of all, it has to be cleared, and that is by the blood of Jesus Christ.